Morning, everyone. Today's lesson is about how not to get old, and I have not mastered that. Apparently, a little bit of background. You'll hear me talk about Dr. Alan Davis, who recently passed away, sadly, which is a little bit unfortunate. But he was a instructor here when I first started back in 2015, and he was here till right around the pandemic. But I like telling stories about him, but I realize nobody will ever understand just the sheer ridiculousness of this individual. All right. Imagine Professor Templeton mixed with me and then add in a sprinkling of tax in there. And that's kind of how ridiculous this human being was. But One of the things that I used to give him a hard time about is he was significantly older than I am, which I feel every day. And he made mistakes in his typing all the time. And I used to tease him a lot about that. And that is karma right there. Okay. You tease somebody about getting old, then all of a sudden when you're going to make a lot of mistakes about getting older. On Monday, this is going to come through the grapevine, so I'm going to head this off right away. On Monday, I was trying to sign in on the 1424 computer to the Microsoft Word account, and I've done this hundreds of times here at Truman State, just get everything set up. But for some reason, just had a mental lapse, and I did not type in my email for Truman State. I typed in my personal email, which is an old Hotmail account from when it first started up back in the late 90s. Okay. So if you hear somebody call about Professor Big Spooky, that's me. All right. Dr. Big Spooky. Yeah. There's a story behind that, but I won't get into it. Anyway, the whole point of this is that I made some errors on Monday when we were talking about the introduction and syllabus, and I wanted to make sure we had that. I also wanted to give you some additional information. So first thing I remembered is that I was talking about the quizzes, and I started talking about getting an average of 12 on the quizzes, and that's obviously impossible considering that the quizzes are only worth 10 points each. The reason why that's an issue is that it used to be the quizzes were worth 15 points apiece, and I've dropped them to 10. You should be able to average somewhere between 6 and 8 points on the quizzes. About a 70% average range should be pretty feasible. I do want to make sure that everybody's clear on that and note that's what my expectation is. Expecting a 12 out of 10 on the quiz. If you pull that off, you're better than I am. All right. So yeah. So you should be teaching the class. That's all I can tell you. That being said, I did recall what I wanted to do for extra credit. I'm not sure why I blanked on it. Again, getting old, so you have to forgive me on that. If you recall, I sent you an email last week notifying you about two things. First of all, we're having a meeting tomorrow at 12:30, which I encourage everybody to show up if they're at all possible to attend. If you can't, I will record it and have it available via Zoom, but I think it's important to be there and present, particularly the GTRAs, so we will have a GTRA meeting afterwards. The other thing that I mentioned was graduate student representative. So I'm a member of the Graduate Council as the graduate program director. I was recently the graduate council chair, but I just stepped down and there's a new graduate council chair, but I still try to take my responsibilities there seriously. And over the time that I've been on the graduate council, which has been 5 years, we have always had an accounting student serve as a representative on there, and they've done fantastic jobs. So I try to encourage that as much as possible. So if you are interested in doing that, I encourage you to do so. If you're not interested, hear me out. All right. So extra credit opportunities for anybody who submits an application for this, with the caveat that if you submit an application and you are selected, you have to serve. So obviously, if you don't want to serve but you still want extra credit, it's in your best interest to rally everybody else around you to submit that. Okay. If you can only serve for a semester, that's fine. If you want to serve for both semesters, that's fine too. But the caveat is that if you submit an application, then you are kind of bound to that obligation. I will give you an option of two items, okay? Two items that you can choose from. Either you can get full credit on a quiz of your choice, like your lowest quiz. So say, for example, that you get a 2 out of 10 on a quiz and you want to replace that and get a 10 out of 10, I'll do that. Or I'll give you 5 points extra on your final exam. Now, the reason that makes a difference is if you do really well on the quizzes, then that replacement probably doesn't make a big difference. So that's why I'm giving you the option for those extra points on the final exam. And that's your choice. I do want to make note that if you just flat out miss a quiz because you didn't show up and it's an unexcused absence, that quiz will not be qualified for replacement. I will not replace a quiz that you just flat out missed. I don't anticipate that being a problem for this group of students, but I do want to make sure that you know that you can't just say, I'm already good. I'm just going to blow off this quiz because I put them in my application. Anyway, Consideration of these applications will take place next Wednesday, so you all have a week to decide if you want to do that. I provided a link for the representative application here on that. It's also in the email I sent out last week. Also, I would appreciate it if everybody here would go to that page on Brightspace. You will notice it's the course materials link on content tab. There's another link that I provided that you probably didn't see before. It's called the Graduate Student Survey. This is a survey we do of our MAC students every year just to kind of get an idea of what their internship experience and their career prospects are like. It's very, very short and to the point. I will tell you that this will not be shared externally. The only people who have access to this information are the accounting faculty and the dean. So if you're a little bit antsy about sharing that information, it is privileged, and we are just trying to get an understanding of what is going on with accounting placements. This is particularly important for this particular class because if you don't know, there's a lot of antsiness and concern about what the career prospects for graduating accountants look like because of two letters. Anybody know what those two letters are? AI, yes, AI. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to assuage your fears as much as possible through the course of the semester, but I do want to get an understanding of what the placements look like. There have been some news articles about especially the big four firms reducing their recruiting out. Now, if you've already got a job placement, kudos, hold on to that and do your best to make sure that that's a good opportunity. If you don't panic. We're going to do everything in our power to make sure you have a job opportunity if you leave. All right. But that's something that I do want to make sure we understand. Part of this is going to be understand who does have job placements and who does not. And we're going to try to help out anybody who does not to make sure that you have all the possibilities in place to moving forward. Yeah, so please make sure that you fill out the graduate student survey regardless, and we'll fill out the application if you're interested in that extra credit opportunity, and of course, serving on the graduate council. Yeah, so that's going to be the announcements. I apologize for not having those in place on Monday. A lot going on, and again, I'm old, so there's that. So real quick, before we break into groups and we start our first group assignment, let's just go ahead and do some AIS review and expansion. So this should look pretty familiar, particularly if you've still got the slides back from 367. If you don't, they're not necessary. These slides will suffice, but you may want to make sure that you take notes on this and refer back to your notes if you still have them, because this is going to be all review content today. I think for the most part, I think there's like one or two slides that I added, but just for reference, I think everybody in this room is a student who was here at True Students, right? In fact, I know that everybody was. I do put this on there because I have a nasty habit of referring back to previous classes, and I refer them by their numbers and not their names. So if you hear me say one of the class numbers and you don't recall, you can feel free to let me know. So what class was that again, Dr. Barnes? The ones that are going to be the most prominent to note are going to be 367, which is accounting information systems, and 417, which is auditing, which is kind of ironic that I picked the two classes that I taught you all. But those are the ones that I refer to quite frequently in this course. Anyway, so what is an information system? The definition that we worked with back in 367 was an integrated set of components for collecting, storing, and processing data for providing information and knowledge in digital products. This is kind of a cluster of details, and the definition itself is not particularly relevant, but it does belie something, or not belie, but it does underpin something that's really, really critical for the understanding of information systems. It has to do with two things that we're going to talk very heavily about in this course. The first of those being the separation between this idea of data and information, which we're going to get into before. What's another way to characterize the concepts of data information, something we talked about back in AIS? If you don't remember, you can skip forward to the next slide. If you do remember, kudos to you. Input and output, yes. Splitting this out into two parts, okay? An integrated set of components for collecting, storing, and processing data, input, and providing information and knowledge for digital products, that's output. That's really all there was to this definition, is trying to delineate the ideas of input and output, which has become very, very critical for our purposes because we're going down to understand what does an input represent and what is an output. And those two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Something that serves as an input in one spot or an output in one spot could be an input in another spot. So just because we categorize it as data and just because we categorize something as information doesn't mean information can't serve as a data point for something else in the future. That being said, they do represent two fundamentally different concepts. Now, before we get to that, let's talk about the concepts of what is an accounting information system. And if you remember, I made a joke back in AIS when I presented this slide to you. I said, it's basically this definition back here but with accounting added in. Literally, I just took this definition and I did add the words accounting to it. But it's a little bit more complex than that. So there are three components that we need to be aware of, and we can break these down pretty easily. A system that records, processes, reports on transactions to provide financial and non-financial information. Now, we can kind of think of this as our traditional accounting function. This is what we're going to be using accounting information for internal and external processes. So when we talk about external processes, that's what you learned in your financial accounting classes. So 220, 302, 303. And then our internal processes are going to be the managerial and cost accounting components, which are going to be 221 and 350, 311. I don't remember any of the numbers. Cost accounting, I forget all the numbers, okay, because I don't have my hands on that. Although Dr. Caden has threatened to make me teach cost accounting when Dr. Artero retires. Take that what you will. All right, I can't even remember the number of the course. All right, so the second part of this is going to be using accounting information to aid in decision making. And this is kind of the big picture analysis. It does loosely tie in to the first part, because if we don't have the first part helping us aggregate information, we can't make the good decisions. But this is more of a management function. This is more an executive function in the organization for strategic and planning purposes. And then we have the third one, which of course, the third one's going to be my favorite because it deals with my favorite thing of all time, controls. All right, appropriate levels, internal controls. And I left the definition in there, even though by now everybody should know what internal controls are. Security measures to protect sensitive data for these transactions. So again, basically aggregation of accounting information is kind of our first one. Decision making is the second one, and then internal controls are our third purpose. That's basically all the breakdown of accounting information system is for. Now, does it do more than that? Absolutely. But this is going to be kind of our starting point where we launch off and we start evaluating this from a much bigger context. And trust me when I say AIS is going to be much, much greater in this course than it is going to be what we talked about in 367. We were very, very concerned about the elements of an accounting information system. Now we're kind of concerned about what is the overall hemisphere of an accounting information system? What is it subject to with respect to controls, to security, to governance, things along those lines. So we can kind of see our discussion, our definition in a very, very simple form. And this diagram that I put up here, you don't need to memorize the diagram. This is just for illustrative purposes. But this should resonate with you all, even though this is a very simple data flow diagram. It's not particularly difficult to interpret. The inputs are going to be source documents, which are basically represented through items that are generated over the process of reporting and aggregation of detail. That can actually go into two different directions. You can actually put it directly into the system if it's something that needs to be transacted immediately, or it can go to the store file, which is basically going to be used for later on purposes. So everybody remember back when we talked about storage in AIS, it was very, very brief. And some people may not have heard it because I stopped talking about flowcharts now in detail. But the whole purpose of the storage function was to actually, originally the intention was to accommodate timing differences. So you gather a piece of information and you don't report on it until the end of the month. So storage was basically to say, we need this piece of information for further reporting in the future. So that was the whole purpose of storage. Now, has storage gone on to mean something more profound in most organizations? Can we take data and can we mine it for value? Is that possible into this day and age? Obviously it is. I wouldn't have mentioned it otherwise, but yeah. So storage has kind of taken on a new level of complexity. But initially, the whole purpose was to say, let's take this information or let's just take this detail and let's hold on to it until we absolutely need it. But we report it. It goes to the journal ledger, the trial balance, and then to the financial state reports. And the financial state reports are kind of our traditional set of outputs that we've talked about before. All right, something I want to reflect on. Hopefully, when I introduced you to this back in 367, there was back a 50-50 chance that you may not have seen this before. Hopefully, everybody's seen this by now. This is Statements on Financial Accounting Concepts number 8, Conceptual Framework for Financial Reporting. Now, in AIS, I focused on one item in this particular table, and this is the only one that you need to know for this course, though I would recommend that you have some familiarity with all these components, especially if you're going to be doing anything with financial accounting. So can anybody remember what we talked about in AIS? Which one was the most important one? So I'll give you a hint. It has the word constraint by it. It's cost, okay? Specifically, the benefit of providing accounting information has to exceed the cost of providing the information. This is true in an accounting information system, is that the benefit of anything that we do in an AIS has to exceed the cost of providing it. It would be great if we could place $1 million control But if that control only eliminates $1,000 worth of risk, it's probably not worthwhile. Okay. So we do need to be able to quantify this to some degree. Now, sometimes it's difficult to quantify. This is a really big problem with respect to governance, how to quantify the benefit from a particular item. So this is why this is so important and why I'm bringing it back up again, is that trying to determine benefit versus cost can be really, really problematic with respect to big picture analysis. So yeah, this is kind of the constraint that's noted in statements on financial accounting concepts number 8. That's what happens when I talk too quickly. Is that we do need to make sure that the benefit of our accounting information system is greater than the cost of generating the information from that system. All right. So I've already done it once today, but contrary to popular opinion and occasionally words that come out of my mouth, data and information are not the same thing. All right. Data is the raw, untransformed input, whereas information generally represents the transformed output. Information natively is going to have more value than data, particularly if we're talking about non-structured data. So we think about data as being something pretty basic, like the information, and I see I did it just then, about the details in a spreadsheet. But can you actually be more granular with the data? Can it be something even more basic? Like if I took a recording of somebody walking along, or people walking along the street, could that be data? Yeah, we could use that. The question is, how do we transform that information? And that's the challenge that we have in this day and age. Now, unfortunately, the tools that we have in this course, we're not going to be transforming this detail into information. We're going to be sticking to kind of traditional data streams. But in the future, that's going to be something that we're going to have to figure out how to incorporate. But information is defined as data being organized in a meaningful way to be useful to users. It serves data serves as an input. Information generally serves as an output, though again, I want you to make sure that you hold on to what I said earlier, is that information is not necessarily defined just as an input because it can be used as an output, but because it can be used as an input in later stages as well. All right, so really quick, I'm not going to focus very heavily on ERPs, but we do need to talk very quickly about ERPs. We did actually have some experience with an ERP back in AIS. Everybody remember NetSuite? Good old NetSuite, Enterprise Resource Planning, a tool. The whole goal of an ERP is basically to be a centralized database that we can collect data. And that data takes a number of forms that I've listed over here. That's not an exhaustive list. Obviously, the nature of the organization can be much, much broader, and it can actually incorporate a lot of different things. But this is a pretty good list. And if you have familiarity with all of these items up here, if you can look at this and say, I remember what these are because Dr. Barnes was so thorough in talking about them, I retain that knowledge. Great. If you look at the word purchase orders, like what is that again? You might want to do some research. All right, you might want to do some drill downs. But hopefully all of those terms are fairly straightforward to you. Now, the reason this is important is because the accounting information system usually serves as the foundation for our enterprise resource planning system. The things that we do for ERP, the things that we did back in NetSuite, we cannot do those unless we have a strong foundation, a strong AIS to actually generate that detail. So that's why we're going to kind of rank those. So AIS and ERP, they're not interchangeable terms. AIS is kind of the backbone of the ERP, and we'll see that again a little bit later on in this course. But the ERP can take an order from a system or can order from a customer, fill it, ship it, and create an invoice to bill the customers. And examples of this use might be checking a customer's credit, checking inventory levels in the warehouse, determining when an order can be shipped. So this is basically taking a format, a framework, and providing structure to it. So we can aggregate information. What is the purpose of aggregating this information? Well, the answer is that we're trying to conduct business processes in order to do this. And business processes become the foundation of any organization, defining how the organization is created, how it's out structured. Now, I do want to make a note that this statement I drew directly from the AIS slides, and I'm going to make the same comment I did back in AIS, is that this next statement is a little bit of a misnomer. But the statement that I gave is that everyone in the entire process can view and update the information. It's true that everyone should be able to view the information, but not everyone can do updates. Remember the separation of responsibilities that we talked about in NetSuite and said, we have access to the entire thing because we're administrators, but that's not true for everyone else. Somebody in the revenue process should not be able to access the purchasing mechanisms. So it's true that we can view. I probably should make a little bit of separation saying that they can't, not everybody can update, but they can still view. And that's a really important delineation we need to make. How to wrap up, let's talk about the business process cycles. These are the ones that we talked about in AIS and back in 417, and they really have a strong bearing on how the AIS is structured. So they're the traditional ones, revenue and purchasing. I included cash receipts and cash disbursements here, but I do want you to recall that cash receipts are not exclusive to revenues, and cash disbursements are not exclusive to purchasing or procurement. What that means is that we can receive cash through things other than revenue processes. We can distribute cash through things other than purchasing or procurement. Now we have inventory production, HR, payroll, investing, financing. Those are things that we talked about to varying degrees in other courses. There's also other accounting functions that we do need to be aware of. The other accounting functions are not things that we've talked about directly, but things that we will be exposed to over the course of analyzing AIS and ERP systems. How do we actually characterize flows of information through these processes? Well, generally, we're going to use a diagramming process to do this. So if you remember, we could actually use narrative processes, which is just basically a description of the systems. And then we have visual depictions. The ones that's most common are going to be UML diagrams, which we're not going to talk about in any length in this course because I really don't want to do that to my evaluations. And then we're also going to talk about BPMN diagrams, just very, very basic level here. This is a BPMN diagram, business process model notation. And so all that we're trying to depict here is how do we actually determine what the steps are in a process. This is a really easy one, okay? This is a really basic one. This is one for the revenue process where you're going to the grocery store and buying goods. And presumably somebody is checking you out, which obviously this is a really old slide because we don't do that anymore. We have to check ourselves out. I think it works for both scenarios, but that's kind of how I view it. So scan items and identify the payment method. You'd make a determination of the payment method. There's actually a diamond here. Does anybody remember what the diamond is from the BPMN diagrams? It's a decision process. Yeah, a choice, okay? Something that you could actually use different alternatives for. So process a credit card or accept cash. Those are alternatives. And if you remember, I kind of got really savage about saying you always have to have an opening decision point and a closing decision point. Those are the gateways. I made sure that I was consistent with my own language, my own terminology for this diagram. Then we bag the items and then we close the process. Now, by the way, this is a BPMN diagram. I'm not going to test you on BPMN diagram knowledge. You do need to recognize that it's a BPMN diagram. You don't need to recognize each of the components the way you did back in AIS. That's it. That's all we're going to talk about with respect to AIS review and expansion. But again, please remember that this is stuff that I will cover on the final exam, so I do expect you to have knowledge of it, and there will be some quiz exposure on this as well. So please make sure you follow up on this. All right, go ahead and break into groups.